Hi there! Last time you saw me put the strips on the deck, and now we are going to do the next step, and that is to glue the strips together. Here where I have some narrow gaps, I will use pure epoxy because that will stay good enough in the gaps and it will penetrate the gaps well. Where I have bigger gaps like here, I will have to add a thickener to the epoxy for the epoxy to stay in the gaps. And also on these gaps here, where the epoxy will go down and maybe drip into the hull by gravity. Over here I have some even bigger gaps, and here I will need to add even more filler to make the epoxy into a fairing compound so it will stay in the gaps. Yeah, let's start with this. I will use lamination epoxy for this step. It is mixed 100 gram of base and 55 gram of hardener. First I tumble mix in a round container. And then I transfer the mixture to a square container and mix in a different pattern to get a homogeneous mixture. I get the epoxy into the gaps with 45-degree angle strokes. I also pre-wet the bigger gaps using the brush. I work my way down the hull and avoid getting epoxy into the staples, as that will make it very hard to remove the staples. I don't glue on the plywood top now either, as that would result in a big, very flimsy and fragile surface. It's better to have several small panels and put them together later. The second batch is mixed in the same way, but I add cotton fibers at the end to thicken the epoxy. I use the thicker epoxy on the vertical gaps and to fill the slightly bigger gaps. As the thickened epoxy is more viscous, it stays in the gaps. I also use this epoxy to pre-wet the really big gaps. The third batch of epoxy is first thickened with cotton fibers, and then with some silica to make it less compact. I also throw in a handful of sawdust to make it more wood-like. I use this artificial wood to thicken thin areas and to seal up big gaps. After the epoxy has cured a couple of days, I will do the next step. That will be to remove the staples and fill the gaps around them. Please join me then.